Good afternoon, and welcome to the REMI 35th Annual Users Conference. Apologies for some technical delays. This year, we decided to have the conference using a slightly different format, the remote format. And the good news about this is it gives many people the opportunity to attend the Users Conference who might not have been able to attend in person. And it gives us the opportunity to share and our experiences and thoughts about regional policy analysis and the regional economy. So I'd like to start with some remarks, and I guess in one of these conferences, the risk is always running overtime, and guess what? We're already running overtime. But I would like to make some remarks to set the stage for the next 3 days of discourse on policy analysis. And that is, as we all know, we can hardly get away from it, is economics these days is all about COVID economics. And we know that this means massive disruption and uncertainty. Every economic variable has been off the charts, from unemployment claims to automobile sales to the Fed balance sheet and fiscal policy with an unprecedented rescue package this spring. Secondly, in COVID economics, is government policy is really front and center. You cannot avoid government policy when it comes to this new economy. That means restrictions, closures and openings, whether schools come back into operation, and also the economy has been significantly impacted by a massive fiscal spending and government policy from the monetary side as well. A third thing about economics is that the future economic structure of the regional economy is unknown. But it's important to think about and model nevertheless. So there's this uncertainty, but it kind of means, instead of saying it's uncertain so we can't have any information, is it's more important to have information and modeling in the context of this uncertainty. And then finally, policy decisions need to be made despite this uncertainty. So not to make a policy decision because of uncertainty is in a policy decision in and of itself. So this information is more necessary. So this year, REMI modeling we feel has been even more important than ever. And some of the themes are that there's been more of a focus on forecasting in 2020, and many of our clients who normally don't get involved in forecasting and are looking more at policy analysis have been very active this year in looking at the changes to the economy and what the COVID may mean for the regional and state economy. Secondly, economic model scenarios are particularly critical. It's not so much just to say, here's our projection for the economy and everything looks, smooth and predictable. Policy makers now need a plan A, a plan B, a plan C, and to be informed by various economic scenarios. We've also developed the new REMI IQ Plus model for quarterly economic analysis, which we'll be presenting. And we've been responding to an increase in need for model technical support, research and development, and we have an opportunity to hear from our team of analysts and associates throughout this conference who are there to support These are called hypothetical what-if scenarios. One is a shift in the standard of living, urban versus suburban and rural. The second is a place of residence, place of work shift away from high cost, high contact cities to lower cost and uncongested locations. And third scenario will be a remote work scenario, looking at the sort of restructuring of the spatial distribution of the workforce. First, with better at measuring the material standard of living rather than the non-material standard of. There's a big loss in consumer surplus for experiences like going to a cafe versus goods which we can still purchase with the same value. For example, we have remote universities where the experience is much different than an in-person university education, but thus far, when we're looking at traditional GDP measures, it's not fully taken into account the change in quality of the virtual experience versus the in-person experience. If we're looking at the regional dimension, there's an interest in a more socially distanced lifestyle of the suburbs in rural America, and that's becoming more attractive than urban life. So the first scenario we're going to look at is this, we'll call it an amenity shift. So when we're looking at what's changed in terms of the quality of life due to COVID and social distancing, we set up a Star Cities model in which Region 1 consists of the core counties of Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, and DC, and Region 2 is the rest of the United States. Then the scenario is to say that there's a 20% decrease in the amenity value of Star Cities, which basically means in economic terms is that over time, in the long term, the Star Cities will need to have wages, expected wages 20% above the current level in order to retain the population. Now it says real wages, so this could occur through the adjustment in housing prices, and we'll look at it as an effect which is driven by the reservation wage and migration changes. So we have 6 lines here in this chart to show the results, and to simplify things a little bit, we have the things going up, which is the rest of the U.S. Above the zero, and the regions that have losses, which is the Star Cities. So we see, due to this amenity shift, there's a movement in population, which is the top line in green, so that as the quality of life in the suburbs and rural areas increases relative to the center cities, people will migrate to those regions, to the rest of the United States. This is followed next by a change in employment in the rest of the U.S., and then an increase in GDP for the rest of the United States. And this is all to the detriment of people and jobs leaving the Star Cities. Next, we look at the residence adjustment, just as a second scenario to look at some of the spatial changes in the COVID economy. So we have 2 million workers shift place of residence from the star city centers to the rest of the US. So the assumption here is that the job location continues to be San Francisco or Manhattan or Seattle, but that the workers are more spatially dispersed. They could be in the suburbs or in fact anywhere else in the rest of the United States. And we use the residence adjustment policy variable. Again, this is symmetric. So to look at just 3 lines here is we can consider this from the point of view of the rest of the United States region. And we see that the top line shows the residence adjusted jobs, which increase in the rest of the United States. Now, most of this is that exogenous shock to residence adjustment, about 2 million of these jobs. It was a pretty large job number. So about 2 million exogenously, we took the workers and put the place of residence outside of the star cities. But then there's a further ripple effect on this employment, which brings the numbers up to the almost 3.5 million. And we can see the next line down, the orange line shows the jobs created in addition to that exogenous residence adjustment effect. So that's the employment effect. And then we see population gradually increasing in the rest of the United States. Now, as percent, the way this happens, this is just to focus on the 2 lines now in the star cities. We see as the jobs move outside of the star cities that wages are drop precipitously in the star cities, down by 12%, as workers can live outside these cities. And then population of these regions, of the star cities, declines. It happens very gradually. As that population declines, labor markets once again become a little bit tighter in the star cities, so that gradually drives up wages to a long-term equilibrium at a quite a bit lower population for the star city centers. There's a third way to look at this, or many different ways to look at this, and this is sort of, I guess we could say, an exercise in new economic geography and how the spatial dimension of workers may change. So the start assumption is that due to COVID and the need for social distancing, there has been a very widespread acceptance and use of technologies and other means to do work from at home for any employer in the United States. So there's been a shift, and I'm suggesting that perhaps this might be persistent, is that once people have learned how to do this from an individual level and companies have learned to do this, is that the remote possibility of work may have a long-term increase in labor access, the ability of employers and employees to more easily match across space without being limited to the commuter region. So when we increase this labor access, it's a very interesting result from the model. Initially, star cities lose jobs as competition increases for the rest of the U.S. So if you think about a Google or an Amazon, is that Google has more flexibility to look at workers who are not willing to relocate into Silicon Valley, but may be more qualified than some worker in that local region. So initially, star cities lose jobs in favor for the rest of the country, as firms can hire from a larger labor pool. In the long term, however, this increase in labor access tends to reinforce the star cities' role at the top of the urban hierarchy by access to labor across the United States. So if we kind of put this in real world terms at the firm level, in the short term, we're saying New York may lose jobs because J.P. Morgan can more easily hire workers who aren't within the commuting region of New York. And then, so there's a loss of employment in New York to begin with, but then longer term, as there's better access to labor, that increases productivity at, let's say, Google and J.P. Morgan. It enhances their productivity because they have access to the entire U.S. labor market rather than just an immediate labor market. So this relative increase in competitiveness for the Star Cities company will tend to improve their competitive position with respect to other regions in the U.S., ultimately leading towards more jobs. So it kind of seems counterintuitive that lower access costs might actually reinforce the position of the star cities. Yet we think over the last decade, starting with the fax machine and improved telecommunications and the internet, that distance costs have generally decreased over decades. Yet we see that instead of moving economic activity outside of these top star cities, that we've seen in the last decade, at least, a lot of concentration of jobs and high-paying jobs in the star cities in this sort of longer-term trend that we've seen towards reducing distance costs. Okay, so I don't want to push too much into the next session. I'd like to show some illustrative slides here. First, we see here that we see, as I mentioned, that star cities employment drops initially, shown in orange, but then in the long term increases, and that this is driven by a reduction in labor costs due to the labor market access, which is bigger in the star cities than in the rest of the U.S. And here we see it with composite labor costs. So composite labor costs will measure not only the wage that workers are being paid, but also the access to a large labor pool where each worker has a slightly different, a somewhat different skill set, so that composite labor costs take into account access to workers, because the better fit the worker can be for the position, the more productive the firm can be. So we see when we have better access to workers across the United States, that star cities tend to benefit more from this agglomeration effect than the U.S. average. And then we see that result in the short term. Star cities lose employment as local workers need to compete with the rest of the U.S. But then in the longer term, the improved labor access tends to increase the competitive position of the core regions of the country compared to the peripheral regions of the country. So these examples are just a few different ways to illustrate how we can take the kind of things that we've been hearing about. I mean, what we've been hearing about, changes in housing prices in the city versus other parts of the country, changes in the location of the labor force, and we can then test these in a simulation environment and understand sort of in a rigorous regional science framework how these changes impact the regional economy and the economy of the place where you're working and doing your analysis. So how do we respond to the challenge? One is that COVID disrupts, and these modeling experiments allow us to test our ideas in a simulation framework. Secondly is policies can make a big difference, and actually these results I've shown here are not, deterministic. It's not, this is inevitable the way things go. That with a rapidly changing spatial environment, there's potential for the emergence of new industry clusters. For example, the finance cluster in South Florida may become increasingly competitive because Florida is a very pleasant climate and a low tax location. So it may provide opportunities for cities and regions to develop new clusters. And finally, welcome to the REMI Users Conference 2020. And we're so glad to have so many attending. Apologies for the technical glitches as we go on. And we have an awesome program ahead of us. Thank you so much to all of the REMI model users who have graciously will allow us the opportunity to see their work in a number of different policy areas that they've done over the course of this last year. We have a users roundtable on Thursday afternoon. So if you have questions from a research and development point of view or a support point of view, any ideas or thoughts, this is we'd like to hear those and look forward to your participation in that. Virtual comedy night on Thursday night, and then small group discussions on Friday afternoon. So we have an excellent program ahead of us, and thanks again for joining. At this point, we transition to Scott Nystrom's presentation on COVID in the long term.